Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The War Report, being recorded at a very unique time. We are here on a Saturday morning. By the time this airs, it will be a Saturday afternoon, so I hope you're all enjoying your weekend, and we have quite a bit of a show ahead of us, so we will get right into it. And as I understand, a lot of developments in Bakhmut. Why don't you take us through them?
Okay. Um, so rapid changes in Bakhmut, but first of all, we'll get some of the more boring details out of the way, and those are the positional battles all along the southern front, beginning in Kherson. So it's been widely disproven already, even through American satellite imagery, that one of the islands in the Dnieper, the Kherson region, was not actually taken by the Ukrainians. um the Ukrainians have done um optic operations like this before. They do need to keep the public engaged in Ukraine, because this is very difficult for them and they have to remain optimistic. It reminds me that time where they crossed into the Russian region with a post designating, like, that they made themselves, that they painted themselves and then carried it and put it there and then left shortly after. This isn't to say that they're incapable of making very good precise attacks. They are, and they've proven that. And one such event took place very early this morning. I believe it was still night time, but in the morning, in Crimea. One report says about 10 drones were launched. All were shot down except two. Another report says three drones were launched by Ukraine at Crimea. Two were shot down, and one of them hit a big oil refinery,
And if you give me a minute, I can
uh,
actually get a
or a
picture
depot.
of the attack.
Yeah, it's very significant. So I'm thinking the Ukrainians believe that this was something that is probably going to be used for Russian mechanized units, and that if you take it out now, it will be more difficult for Russia to fight a mechanized war in Ukraine. Now, it comes on the heels, in this, since the last show, two different oil refineries or depots belonging to Ukraine were destroyed in central and south central Ukraine. Um, but here we see that the Ukrainians are quite capable of reaching these targets. Now, I have to say that um, there was an attack on Sevastopol and Crimea several days ago, maybe close to a week ago, and the Russians were successful in knocking all of those down. There was even an attempt using underwater drones that was stopped, and this is where I first learned that the Russians have developed some kind of four layers of protection um, around the island, or the peninsula, if you like. So it's interesting. I think this basically says that you know unless this was a site that they decided not to attack for a long time, because I can't understand how such a big site would be unnoticed. We're 14 months into this war as of yesterday. So I'm thinking, you know, when both sides are fighting, both sides want, like, escalation, right? Because escalation has a psychological dimension to it.
And although it's not the best quality photo, I do have an image on the screen of what that attack on that fuel depot looked like. So as you can see, it's just completely pluming up, and it, as you were saying, it was a massive target. In which case, in my estimation, the only way they couldn't have attacked this before, which does seem strange to me, but the only thing I can think of is they simply weren't capable of attacking it before for whatever reasons, whatever defenses were around it or protecting it. They were able to
Yeah,
finally
they
slip
might have
through that.
tried, or they might have just said, "Not, this isn't the right time."
Yes, and as you're right, it's all about timing because especially looking at a picture like this, a lot of war, especially in the 20 now it's always been this way, but now that photography and video is instantaneous, the optics, how something looks just to the naked eye, is all the more important.
Right. So we've just covered Crimea. positional battles in the Kherson area. They're basically just artillery duels, and this goes for virtually all of Zaporozhye. Uh, if we if we go to Ugledar, um, then there are more fierce battles, more like the kind that we're seeing in Bakhmut and Avdiivka. The Russians have started dropping more and more bombs, and more of the high rises there are being destroyed. Um, this will reduce the advantage that the Ukrainians have because, of course, this is a very flat area, and like not only are is everybody in this war dealing with satellites, real-time imagery, they're also dealing with a very flat terrain with very few places to hide, and the places to hide are so obvious that even if you're not sure that anyone is there, uh, bombing them with artillery, right, is almost a guarantee that you're going to cause some kind of attrition. But in any case, most of the dashtchas on the north side of the river there, the Russians have recaptured that entire area, and now they're across the highway from an area where there's a salt mine, and it has two big towers. One seems to be somewhere between 15 to 20 stories. The other one seems to be about 8 to 10. They've started bombing around this area, so that's really kind of like another feature that has continued to develop, and that is uh, Ukraine's missile air defense system is being taken out. So yesterday, no less than three S-300s. Some are saying four. I see three S-300 systems and a Tor system, another air defense system that I don't think is quite up or as sophisticated as the S-300. I could be wrong. Ukraine in the past had said that they would not bring it out, but clearly they have, which demonstrates that they are desperate for air defense. Some have speculated that the reason they brought them out is in anticipation of the Ukrainian counteroffensive because they know that their troops are very vulnerable to air attacks. Um, so, along with that, earlier in the week, in fact, it might have been on the day we recorded last week, um, an Mi-8 and three Su-25s of the Ukrainian Air Force were shot down as well. So, um, and we'll get into like the offensive once we get the minutia minute out of the way, because many of these details
Yes.
relate directly to what's being said in Western media and in Russian media or Ukrainian media for that matter. Um, Moving further north, still extremely grueling, extremely slow battles for Marinka, which is just outside of Donetsk city. It's in the southwestern direction. The Russians have managed to gain a little bit more foothold around Avdiivka, particularly in the northwest, and they've started to attack more closely within Avdiivka as we speak. And then I guess we can get to where so much of the battle is taking place, and that is Bakhmut. So I sent you two photos initially, but I sent you another one. Um,
Okay, I can
the
I can
first,
get those.
yeah, the first one is Wagner, which is kind of like, I think that's a day or two old. I think it's a day old. That gives you a general lay of like how much of the city, and you can see that the Russian, that except for the southwest pocket, everything else is controlled by Russia with massive territories to the south and the north. The Russians have reclaimed a part of the road, only a small sliver, but a part of the road, um, that the northern road leading into Bakhmut. But basically, the Russian advance in the western center of Bakhmut has made that road like irrelevant because that road terminated in the city. That when the Ukrainians controlled it, it made sense. But now that there's an area that they control outside of the city in the north, and I've seen videos of columns of Ukrainian soldiers who had fallen trying to get in. That road is kind of not really usable anymore. So now it's only the southern road that leads directly into the western area, southwestern area. The Citadel, as I mentioned earlier, which is a collection of high-rise buildings in the extreme west of Bakhmut. It's kind of like the shape of the letter D on a 45-degree angle. On the west side is just farmland, and the rest faces toward the city. So this is an area that the Ukrainians will not want to give up. Now, they have been detonating more buildings, and probably because they don't like, I think they understand that they're going to lose Bakhmut. And if they do, um, some of these high rises are at least 10 stories high. That will give them a good outlook to deal with Chasiv Yar, because Chasiv Yar is on a high ground, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why it's been difficult for the Russians to take. Although, the other story is, continue the meat grinder and let them go through and just pick them off on the road. Um, you know, Maybe it's a bit of both. In any case, so you can load up the other pictures and it'll give you how much advancements were made just like literally in the last 2, 3 hours.
Okay, I can get a third one up right now. So, okay, and here's the third map, and that actually scaled pretty well, so I don't have to adjust it much there. But
Yeah, yeah. So you can see there's not very much left. And on the west side of the city, it's all farmland. Getting out of there will be very difficult for the Ukrainians without getting spotted. We know that the Russians are continuing to use their air force. They're dropping the fab bombs. Um, that road in the north that I spoke about earlier was cut in one area by bombing it with a fab bomb. Um, but the trench system on the south side of that road is still contested. There are apparently the positional battles in the trenches, like Ukrainians and Russians fighting inside the trench itself. Um, as I said from a few weeks ago, there was poison gas that was used on Russian soldiers. I saw video footage of sort of the same thing happen, but not using poison gas, but using artillery by Wagner and VDV forces against Ukrainian forces in that area. But I'm sure it's been very bloody, and I'm sure it's been heavy losses for both sides. Just trying to cut off that road. Um, in a sense, though, what that did is that it freed up the Russians inside the city to make that road irrelevant, because the only way you're going to get um, support, men and material to the what is ever left of Bakhmut now, you have to drive for extensive periods of time over farm fields, and there that leaves you wide open, and you're going to go slower. And of course, Ukraine has been hit with rain off and on for approximately 2 weeks. Um, so it's very slow going. So that's the situation in Bakhmut.
and just
And
to touch on the point
mm,
of rain, if you remember back in April 2021, when many people speculated that when this war was going to kick off, a lot of the counterclaims that was that it was spring, that it was too rainy. This always happens in Ukraine in the spring. The weather is very rainy because it's very bogged down. It's very hard to have these kind of operations, which will make interesting points against the idea of a counteroffensive in the spring. Now, they did have a counteroffensive in the fall, which is a much drier season, admittedly, but spring is probably the worst time something like this could happen, but there's really not much other choice at this time. So we'll just
yeah,
have to see how that plays out.
right. The Russians have to deal with this as well. But the clock is ticking more on the Ukrainian side, which is why they have to continually flood Bakhmut with fresh reserves in order to hold off the inevitable. Um, I believe it was Sirski who basically echoed what Zelensky had said, and that is that there's a real potential that if they lose Bakhmut, that there will be a collapse of the entire eastern line. Um, Morale would be uh, severely broken for the Ukrainians if that happened, but I think most of the soldiers fighting in and around that area know very well that it's doomed. There are civilians that are still being evacuated out of Bakhmut right now, and they're telling very similar stories to the way that the Ukrainians treated some of them. Um, I would there's a video of two Ukrainian dudes walking in an area that's now under Russian control, and they look at these two women in front of their apartment building, talking to one another, and bas- um, they're they basically call them remainers, and because they're remaining for, and he says, I wish we could just kill them outright. um so some of that kind of stuff did happen. Hopefully it didn't happen to them, or hopefully when they did the live demolition of certain high rises there were no civilians inside, but that can't be guaranteed. um So moving further north, again, just positional battles. The Russians have gained very small territory inside the forest, pushing westward towards the Liman direction. Um, Everything around Kupiansk and those regions remained relatively unchanged. This is where some fab bombs were dropped on a material sort of warehouse of military equipment last week. And that's about it for the minutia minute.
Well, fascinating as always, and this war is in a perpetual state of heating up and cooling down on almost a weekly, bi weekly cycle. Not quite sure how you can put that. Now, the possibility of a spring offensive, as alluded to earlier, is once again looming over all of our heads. And I would imagine that it would have to happen probably once again before the end of spring. I would actually say it would have to happen within the course of the next month. It has to happen before June for it to be a spring offensive, at least for optical reasons, unless they're going to change the narrative to summer offensive. But looking at what we've been told previously, especially when it comes to some things that came out of the Pentagon that were not the so-called leaks from earlier, but statements the Pentagon themselves had said, or other more minor leaks, that U.S. and European allies, quote unquote, are going to pressure Ukraine into negotiation if there isn't significant progress in the war by autumn. And because of that, you had said earlier that people are growing weary of this war in Ukraine. I agree, especially on the western side. While there may be some war weariness in Russia, given the global state of things and how much things seem to be slowly but surely shifting in their favor, and seeing as the fact that the internal situation in Russia hasn't seemed to have changed as much, they probably have a lot more wherewithal for something like this, at least for the time being. But they want to cut Ukraine off. They want to have some sort of solution to this, even if they do have to make minor concessions. But of course, they would prefer to save face. Now, this is nothing new. A million people have said this. So, is this going to be something where they throw just everything they have in an attempt to get a good negotiating position, which also contradicts Zelensky's entire presidency because his entire time in office since the beginning of this war has been doing everything in his power possible to stymie any negotiations. And then that also brings up another question. Is he on his way out? And what are the morale of the Ukrainian forces? And just these questions that keep coming up week after week that never seemingly have a clear answer, and every time we get something approximating an answer, it always raises more questions.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's been an interesting transformation since the leaks. Um, Initially, you had stories running that, oh my God, Ukraine is not really prepared and the outcome might not be that great. Then it was followed like basically they have what they need and they're going to do great. They're going to be very successful. You can find any of these articles, Washington Times, Financial Times, Times of London, Washington Post. They're everywhere. Reuters, all the big names, DW, all the big names have run these stories. And then this week, what has happened is you've had stuff like who was it, Cavoli, who I believe is the general in charge of NATO command in Europe, and um, he made some statements that kind of contradict each other,
Just out of
right? This
curiosity,
whole time.
what's country of origin? Because I think that might give us that. No, no, I'm being serious. I think that might give us some insight into these statements that we're about to get. Because despite NATO being very monolithic in approach, when you break down this level, when you look at these officials from NATO and the EU from the various countries, you can actually learn a lot from what they're saying based on their location and their place of origin.
um, I mean, to me, he looks very American. Like he probably like. I mean, he could be Italian, but to me, he has an appearance that's like very Anglo. So maybe he has like some
I mean,
Italian heritage on
if
his
if
father's
he's
side.
if he's American, yeah, he could very easily be a mutt. That's not unheard of. But the Cavoli name, while did initially strike me as Italian, there's going to be some autism. I could have heard
Mm.
some West Slavic or Hungarian actually out of that,
Oh,
especially
oh,
depending on the
okay.
especially if it were spelled with a K, something like that. And I know that the Czechs have a disproportionate amount of NATO high command officers for some reason, including their current president is a former NATO high command officer. In which case, I for some reason, I don't know. When I first heard the name, it struck me as Hungarian, and I know that the Hungarian military is having. Orban has gone full Stalin. He's purging the high ranks of the military. We'll get into that
Yeah,
in a little
yeah,
bit here.
yeah.
But it would have struck me as interesting if, number one, there was a commander originating from Hungary, number two, making these statements, and it, just a point of personal interest on my part because I do think that we can learn a lot from country of origin on the approach to NATO and who has more of a say. Because once again, I thought Hungarian at first. I thought that was strange that they would even allow the Hungarians to have that kind of seat at the table, even if it is just one individual. And then I thought maybe Czech or even like some parts of Poland. Once again, depending on how it's spelled. And
Right. I mean,
I know I
they've spelt it with a C, but the
mm,
Europeans are spelling it with a K, so I don't know.
I don't know because when I hear it, I think Kavoli, which strikes me as very Eastern European for some reason. But once again,
Hmm.
I was fascinated in particular if he was Czech, because I think that would tell us a lot. Because the Czechs have once again, they're like the Baltic states, like Chihuahua countries when it comes to this, especially this conflict.
Yeah.
So I would have been curious, but do continue.
Yeah, so um I think you know, he made some statements earlier. Now he was in the Arms House Committee, uh, but he made statements that CNN reported prior to that a few days ago. He met with the U.S. Arms Committee, I believe, yesterday. But prior to that, he said that in the CNN article that the Russian army is bigger than the army that initially invaded Ukraine, which again, you don't. Not that he's not quoting leaks, but that's obvious, right? Because there was never a over all of Ukraine. In any case, he did say that they have adapted and that the attrition on the Russian forces has not been what many suspected. It has not been as bad. Now, when he spoke at the House committee, he he had a slightly different take. He basically reiterated those points, but he was more vague, especially when he was asked, okay, by Blumenthal, one of the senators. Look, we don't want, Blumenthal said, a fair fight. We want an unfair fight. Does Ukraine have what it needs right now to defeat Russia in its counteroffensive? Again, his reply was very vague. He says, we have, delivered virtually everything that we promised, and we believe they have enough to mount a counterattack. Now, I think if you read between the lines, what he's saying is this: yes, 98% of everything that we promised them, I mean, they literally say over 98%. So let's say there's only 1.5% left. Um, that leaves Ukraine on the lurch, essentially, right? If they lose, it will be Ukraine's fault, right? And you can make that argument because basically, when the Americans were telling them leave Bakhmut, they wouldn't. So the way to make sense of it is if they received 98% of everything that they wanted, and that contradicts maybe what the leaks that originated in early February were saying. Mind you, is this, there was still 2 months till our time now, roughly speaking, or let's say 7 weeks. So there's a bit of discrepancy there. Okay. But that is what they're saying now. And what that means is basically in holding on to Bakhmut, Ukraine has lost a lot of the material that was given to it. They're not saying that directly. They're hoping that you infer, right? If 98% of what they promised is already there, and the Ukrainians are saying that's still not enough, why is it still not enough? Where has the bloodiest battle of this war been fought? In Bakhmut. So obviously, that's where the vast majority of men and material attrition is taking place. And they also waste, honestly, they also waste a lot of their ammunition. So 9 people were killed yesterday in a HIMARS attack and shelling on Donetsk city, which killed an 8-year-old girl and her grandmother and killed 7 others when there was nearly a direct hit on a bus going through the city. They all know this. You know, the targeting for the HIMARS system requires direct American participation. Uh, at least 3 different Ukrainian generals at 3 different times have said, or representatives of Zelensky's government have said, um, that um, the Americans directly aid them in targeting with HIMARS, right? So it's Americans that approve this kind of stuff, right? Uh, anyways, not to get sidetracked. So, I mean, I believe the Ukrainians are going to have to mount an offensive. Um, but the Ukrainians are kind of holding it off. It seems we still don't know what's really going to happen, but they're saying we still need more equipment, and like they're asking for F-16s. The F-16 nonsense is just that. It's nonsense, right? Um, where are they
Oh,
go
did you
like
see that
where the
video that the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense put out about the F-16 on Twitter?
no, I haven't.
They made a synthwave compilation of the F-16 begging Europe and the Americans to give them
Oh
F-16s.
my God. Like so much of their
A
stuff is
week
so
after
cringy.
they sent contaminated grains to Slovakia. Here,
Mm,
here, please, please give us MiGs, give us F-16s. We have contaminated grain. It's a fair trade. It's the best trade. It's the best deal in the history of the deal, maybe even ever. Um,
yeah.
I mean, you want to talk about audacity? You want to talk about audacity of any leader of any country? Talk to me about Zelensky. I've never seen anyone.
Hmm.
Now, I haven't been alive that long, admittedly. I haven't been following politics an even shorter amount of that time. But I've not seen anyone as audacious as Zelensky ever. And even going back to the records, even going back and looking at events in a retrospective way and reading events about the past, etc. In what? The past 50 years, I don't think there's been anyone nearly as audacious as Zelensky.
Yeah, no. There really hasn't been. Um Yeah, I don't know. Like they wasted a lot of their time in Bakhmut, but they also wasted a lot of. See, another way you can look at the spring offensive is like if you dissect what Zaluzhny said after they took Kherson City, after the Russians left Kherson and blew up the bridge, right? He said this was only a partial victory because our goal was to get the Russians to fight in Kherson like to the last man and to surround them, right? Um, what they had hoped would be, I think, would be the blowing up of the dam, which would flood the Dnieper south of and west of Novokhovka, and that would strand the Russians. Right now, it would also mean crossing the Dnieper would be more difficult later. But there were roughly around 25,000 Russian troops in the Kherson region, and they got away. And the Ukrainians, if you remember way back in November, I read to you one of the Twitter guys that's on the Ukrainian side. He like he follows NAFO accounts, but he himself is not a NAFO account. I think his the first initials of his last name are POM, and then it's something R and then KO.
Yes.
I don't know if it's Pomerenko or whatever. He said, the reality is it cost us 10,000 lives to take this city. And some would argue that's a conservative estimate, that the estimate might even have been higher. But in any case, so Zaluzhny says, we
I've just
didn't
come
get
to
what we
assume that
wanted.
all estimates are higher.
Yeah, it's probable, right? Um, no country wants to admit how high the losses have been. Um, some are more honest than others, but it always you always have to be speculative to some degree. So um and while we're on the whole area of Nikolaev and Kherson, the Russians claimed they shot another um command post with 20 officers that they claim included even some British and American officers from NATO. I don't know. The Ukrainians have responded by saying the building was empty. It's hard to say. You can't really verify it either way. Um, but to get back to Kherson, so I think Zaluzhny, what he wanted to do was attrition, right? He wanted to kill all these guys. He wanted to have a lot of prisoners for prisoner exchange. Just think back, Prigozhin exchanged something like 100 for 200 prisoners of war, but that extra amount freed two priests of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that were being held in jail. So if you, I keep wandering off topic. I'm sorry. So Zaluzhny, basically, what he wanted to do was destroy the Southern Army when he took Kherson City, and then keep pressing forward. I think the spring offensive is really trying to clear up unfinished business that did not succeed in the fall. I think that is when Russia had the least amount of men. The opportune time was when something like 50,000 soldiers served their first 6 months at the end of August. That was the right time to attack. Remember that Putin was visiting, he was in Asia, and they were showing off their you know military, naval military, and so on. And there was the incredibly successful Ukrainian Kharkov offensive because they were unmanned. But it doesn't matter. They took it. That's how Russia took many of the areas in the south. And so what you got was a situation that did not give the results that the Ukrainians badly needed. And the spring offensive is really just to finish what the autumn offensive could not finish and was very costly. Now, I think the next big mistake was perhaps holding on to Bakhmut. You could argue that not holding on to Bakhmut, would just bring the war to Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka and Slavyansk, but and it would probably be the case. Um, but the Russian forces would have to regroup before they could do that. They'd have to go through the same process. So maybe they would have bought as much time. Maybe they wouldn't have bought as much time. I don't know. Um, but this whole spring counteroffensive, the reason it became a thing was because the fall counteroffensive wasn't there, and Cavoli basically just reiterates what many podcasters were saying for months and months at the end of 2022, that it cost Ukraine too many men, too many experienced men, and not just in Bakhmut. Bakhmut wasn't a thing back then. The Russians didn't even control half of Solidar at that time. Um, but what it did is it just bled out too many well-trained forces and too much material. Now they do have 1,500 armored infantry fighting vehicles, so that's not a joke. That's 400 more than I thought. That's substantial, right? And
And
about
that's been the crux
230 to
of their entire
240
strategy,
tanks.
especially in the counteroffensives, where it was these very light, rapid-moving forces that were able to pick
Yeah.
away at the time at least, was an undermanned, undersupplied, and underdefended Russian line. Now, the question is, have those things been rectified? Well, I'll put it this way at least. I think they are better than what they were, say, in August and September of 2022. And really, what it comes down to is the Ukrainians, best case scenario, might be able to throw a counteroffensive at this, might be able to
Mhm.
reverse some Russian gains, turn the war in their favor ever so slightly, but it's going to be costly in supplies, which is a much lower concern because that can be made up with more and more Western donations. They can just scrape more and more weapons out of Europe and America and elsewhere. America can go raid Cuban arsenals or Serbian arsenals or whatever and send them abroad to Ukraine. But more concerning is the manpower shortages.
Mhm.
I think that was History Legends did a good video talking about the manpower shortages in Ukraine right now, and a lot of that can actually be attributed to that the conscription drives disproportionately affect central and eastern Ukraine as opposed to western Ukraine. And at some point, if they're going to want to have at least some sort of functional army, they will have to expand the conscription drives more into the west of Ukraine and not have these guys to join these volunteer battalions that sit hundreds of miles behind the line. And
Yeah.
they don't want to throw their, I guess, what they consider ethnic stock into this meat grinder. But what other option do they have in terms of victory? Are they going to build another dirty bomb and convince the world to, or threaten to build another dirty bomb and convince the world to intervene against Russia? And do they think the Europeans are capable of intervening against Russia without the Americans? Do they even think the Americans are? Especially when you have the consideration of China and Taiwan there. What is the end game for Ukraine here? What is their
Mhm.
ultimate plan? What are, and this isn't just Zelensky, the entire Ukrainian government, what is the hope here? I know a lot of these people are at the top, they're scraping, they're living like kings in the middle of this hellish war, but at the end of the day, what is the end? I mean, look, from the Western perspective, it's simple enough. Use Ukraine to whittle down Russia enough to hopefully keep them weaker in case of future conflict, either involving Russia itself, or China, or Iran, or whoever else. But when it comes to the so called Ukrainian patriots, the so called Ukrainian nationalists, what are they trying to accomplish? At
Yeah.
Once again, and it becomes less and less clear cut by the day. And what I also find interesting here is there was a lot of discussion at the beginning of the war, which I somewhat bought into, that this has solidified the Ukrainian ethnogenesis. This war solidified Ukraine as a nation. Well, you already have the Ukrainian government coming out, and I think it was actually Zelensky himself. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, saying they need to eliminate, quote, the language of the oppressor from Ukraine, of course, referring to Russian speaking Ukrainians and ethnic Russians within the country. And I don't know, if you ask me, that's the exact opposite of ethnogenesis. So you figured it'd be grafting on these, let's just say, people in the central and especially in the east who are much more oriented towards Russia proper. But at the end, you have these guys drawing up troops from places like Kharkov, which was very pro-Russian back in 2014, took a paramilitary occupation force to really keep the city pro-Ukrainian, and also mass exodus, whether to Russia or elsewhere, in order to really change the climate in somewhere like Kharkiv, and you've also seen this in places like Kherson and other parts of eastern Ukraine. But how do you expect to keep these people loyal? How do you expect not to have a complete collapse in morale? And look, maybe as far as they're concerned, they don't care about the fate of central or eastern Ukrainians more in particular, and that it's better if they either desert the country or end up in a ditch in Bakhmut or wherever. But speaking completely practically, how do you expect Ukraine to have longevity as a nation? And that's not even counting the mass amount of emigration that's been going on since 2014, especially since the outbreak of this war. It's not just people in eastern Ukraine that are leaving. It's not just people in eastern and central Ukraine that are leaving. As soon as the floodgates open, Western Ukrainians were all over Poland, all over the Western world. Once again, what is the future of Ukraine, and what the hell is even the plan for the future of Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I mean, the Americans have been very consistent about what the plan is, and that's just to bleed the
Of course,
Russians.
from
So,
their perspective,
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah. From their perspective,
it,
yeah. I mean,
it's
I mean, even Arestovich. I
oh,
believe
remember
it was on
him?
the 20. Yeah, so Arestovich, he has this like interview podcast show with this guy, and he says the mistakes of it's titled "The Mistakes of the West." The quote: "The blood is being shed, among other things, because of the Western policy of the last decades and their unfulfilled promises," referring to the Budapest Memorandum, which did not ensure the security of Ukraine after the country renounced nuclear weapons. He also chided that the U.S. for its readiness to fight for Taiwan and South Korea, but not for Ukraine. Quote, "The United States is ready to stand up for allies in the Pacific region to prevent war. And the biggest war of the century is raging on the European continent. But we hear about the difficulties with the transfer of long range missiles, aircraft, and tanks to us. And the West discussing possible reductions in aid, depending on the success and the liberation of our territories," Arestovich said, calling on the allies to return to the ground. Also, according to him, only a nuclear status or joining NATO can guarantee the security of Ukraine. So, I mean, they're definitely angry, but in a way that again reflects the point that the U.S. has always made from time to time, even though it contradicts their message, which is we're going to use Ukraine to weaken Russia. Like, it's less important. It would be great if Ukraine could weaken Russia and Ukraine gets all its territory. But ultimately, the first order of things is to weaken Russia. And far more important is containing China.
And that's what it comes down to the end of this. I'll reiterate once again, Ukraine had the potential to be a very successful post-Soviet state. It could have found itself in a very similar position to a country like Turkey, where it could play that balancing game. It could
Hmm,
be
hmm.
as simultaneously pro-West as pro-Russia. We're talking about a nation upon the collapse of the Soviet Union that had about 40 million people, some of the most fertile farmland in the world, industry, resources, geography, you name it. They could have leveraged the West and Russia against each other had the
Yes.
leaders there had, number one, any foresight, and number two, actually gave a damn about the country. Because you look at the post-Soviet elites of Ukraine, you thought the ones in Russia were bad. The ones in Ukraine were far worse. And as many have put it, Ukraine looks is today what Russia would look like if it were the Yeltsin cabal still in power, if it were people like that still in power, and if it weren't people like Putin in power who cracked a whip on the oligarchs. Now I know you can say that they're still
Hmm.
there, but point being is there is a much more balanced relationship between state power and oligarchy in Russia there is today, especially today after the outbreak of the war, than there was in 1999, and you just can't deny that.
Yes. Yeah. So I think, I mean, the other thing that sort of occurs to me now is like when we would talk about when Trump was in power that the policy of the U.S. is schizophrenic, and that's because there were two different factions. I think there are two different factions even now as to how should this war be prosecuted. You have the war hawks who are absolutely committed to destroying Russia, that they cannot ever be fulfilled until that happens. And then you have the other side that is saying, we're causing irreparable damage. Um, the mask has dropped off. Everybody realizes we control Europe, that, the last few decades we've cultivated an entire class of European elites that listen to everything that we say, even if it's bad for them. um like the whole world is watching that, right? They do see that. They do understand where, like, cooperation and then vassalage to the US goes, and they don't want to become a part of that. So
And once
they're
again, I
less
cannot
willing.
think of a greater quote in the past century to encapsulate this than Henry Kissinger's own words that to be
Yeah.
America's friend is fatal. Look, I will once again preface for anyone who may take this out of context. Now, I'm not saying that about our wonderful audience because I think they know us well enough to know what we're saying, but if there's any newcomers, there's anyone who wants to be disingenuous about this, I'll just put it on the record. Of course, there's always power dynamics between powerful countries and less powerful countries. I'm not going to pretend like Russia's this bastion of treating all countries equally. No, no, but at least respectably so, Russia and China act more in their own direct interest. I can see where point A leads to point B. The American empire is just an anti civilizational force at the end of the day. It is anti
It,
culture, anti civilization. This thing is behemoth. Now, look, I would say much the same thing about maybe the, let's just say, very early Soviet Union, say pre 1937, pre World War II. And I think there's other countries that would also fit this bill. No,
maybe pre 1927.
yes, especially. And look, I would say there are other countries that fit this bill. Arguably, the Mongols played the same kind of role, but once again, this is not something I want to get into too great of detail right now. But as shown, at least back in the day, at least even up until the past decade, there were immense financial and economic incentives to join the American empire. And I'm talking carrot, not stick. Your country's GDP would skyrocket when you joined the European Union, NATO, and these other American empire led organizations. Then it shortly became the stick. Well, if you don't cooperate with these organizations, you're going to get sanctioned. Now, they were doing that before, but they became more reliant on the stick. And now the stick is all they have. Out of carrots, no more carrots. What do they have to offer? Look, love Russia, hate China, love or hate Russia or China, whatever. They have plenty of carrots left to offer. They have plenty of stick too, but point being is they have both. U.S. only has one. So what's more appealing to Saudi Arabia? The idea of being sanctioned and having their markets manipulated by Americans, or rigging the oil price with Russia? What is more appealing to, let's say, a country that isn't as developed but also has a wealth of geography and natural resources like Indonesia? Cooperation with Russia and China for economic gain, or complying with the American empire to no gain except just complete subjugation? At the end of the day, look, I think a lot of these countries intrinsically understand that they will have to pay tribute to the greater power. Whatever, that's going to happen at some point. But the question is, what can the greater power do in return for them? And as it stands right now, there's really nothing that the Americans can do as the greater power to make it worth their while.
Yes. So I mean, I don't know if we brought people to use, the American dollar is still overwhelmingly the dollar that's used in trade, but it slipped in use by 10 times what took 20 years to get to where we were in 2021. So that's what 2022 uh, showed.
And if
And
you
I
give me a
think it's
moment,
just
I'll actually get the trade maps between the US and China showing the dichotomy over the past 20 years, because I think it's very telling. And this was from, I believe, 2001 to 2020. So I can just get that thing right here, and it's just loading right. Oh, there it is. This is 1980 to 2018, which is even better. And this one is actually a GIF which shows the process that's happening. So I will see if this will come up on my screen with the tech stuff, because I think it does paint a very interesting picture of how
Mhm.
things go on.
Yeah, I mean, there are big changes. I don't know how much time we'll have for Sudan. I think it's a very complicated situation. But one thing that I've learned recently, and I think it was the guys from World War Now. So Sudan, because there are gold mines, and Wagner protects those gold mines, and Russia buys gold from Sudan, and then it sells that gold also to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has been selling. No, it then Russia sells that gold to China. China has started buying um, oil from Saudi Arabia in gold, and some of it is this Sudanese gold. Um, I don't know which side is on which side. Well, I mean, there is a timeline to Sudan. I guess we'll get to it briefly later. Uh, let's just say that for China and Russia, what they want is definitely peace because it's to their advantage to do
Peace is
so.
profitable, even
Yes,
more,
and
even more so
not the
than war
least
in
of
some
which.
cases.
Mhm. So, anyways, that's something I didn't realize. But um, yeah, I don't know if you want to move on to other news or
Yeah, I can get that, and I couldn't get the map to work unfortunately, but I will get that graphic one of these days because it is a fascinating one. But we do have plenty of news out of other parts of Europe and across the world as a whole. So I think I'll start with some of the news out of Russia, some of the news relating to Russia in particular, and that is some interesting statements by one of the Chinese ambassadors, particularly the Chinese ambassador to France, regarding the global situation. Now, since 1992, because Soviet Union collapsed just days before 1991 ended, so more appropriately 1992, we had a very unique situation when it came to the status of these former Soviet states. Who is the success of the Soviet Union? What is the status of these countries? What should be done with these countries? And most of those questions were answered. For example, Russia was declared the inheritor of the Soviet Union's legacy, both in terms of its nuclear arsenal, its debts, its seat on the UN and other international organizations. The Russians got all of that. But then the question is, should NATO be extended to these Eastern European states? What should be done with Central Asia? And we're seeing these questions play out right now. But the Chinese ambassador to France, Liu She, says that the post Soviet countries have effectively no status under international law, which he's correct. International law is a complete farce. I think we all realize that. I don't think there's anyone here who would even try to begin to dispute that. But the formalities, as dumb as it may sound, are important. It does matter what is said and how is said, even though it is rarely followed through and rarely are those principles lived up to. But when you're having not only a Chinese ambassador, but a Chinese ambassador to France of all countries, France being one of the pivotal players in the American empire and one of the tentatively more renegade ones, I don't want to give them too much credit on that front, but when he says that, it is somewhat of an endorsement of. Now, of course, China has always given somewhat of an endorsement of Russia's activities in Ukraine, all the way back to the annexation of Crimea, just by refusing to condemn them. But it is somewhat of an endorsement, I should say, of the restructuring of the post-Soviet world. Whereas China, for years, there's been this tendency to believe that they're going to flip, that they're going to realize their economic interest and realign themselves with the American empire. Well, maybe this war back in 2014 would have caused this, but no, this isn't going to be now. Because you already have the trajectory of China's economic growth. Even after COVID, they still recovered to an immense degree. And American economic growth, for perspective, this past year is only at 1.1%, which isn't a recession, but it's stagnation. It's not where you want your economy to be.
Mhm.
So, when it comes to the economic leverage, China is breaking more and more free from the U.S. grasp, and with the several economic and political deals they've made with several countries over just the course of these past 3 years. Look, I'm not saying China can survive a complete breakdown of trade with the U.S., but they're in a far better position to survive, say, maybe even a Russia-style sanctions campaign than they would have been in 2014 or even, say, 2020 if the situation would have escalated that much. So that's completely off the table. And of course, the Chinese are interested in reshaping the world order as well. And it's just an admission of truth, the complete realization that these countries are statelets. They have no stake, they have no future in this world that is independent of whatever the major players in the world say. That these countries could effectively be wiped off the map tomorrow. Now, of course, maybe you'd say, oh, Ukraine disproves that. Well, at the end of the day, again, Ukraine, to quote Viktor Orban, is an insolvent country. There is nothing to it. It exists solely because of economic support from the West at this point. And
Mhm.
that's the reality of all these former Soviet states. If, say, conflict were to break out with, gee, I don't know, Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhstan, having more resources and more people, would probably stand a bit more of a chance if there were a color revolution than a subsequent war. But again, and now maybe combined with the war in Ukraine and other crises, that could be enough to make Russia buckle under the pressure. But the vast majority of post-Soviet states, I would say Russia and Kazakhstan notwithstanding, are just that. They're irrelevant. They do have no status, and I think that somebody coming out and saying that is very important and really puts things into the proper perspective on how we should be looking at these sort of situations.
Yes. Um, and I mean, I totally agree with that. There is it's slightly off topic, but as far as like Russian and European and Ukrainian news, yeah, I didn't expect this, but the Russians have begun to block Ukrainian grain ships along the corridor. The Russians have been complaining for a long time.
Saving the world from the contaminated grains.
Yeah. Um, but they've held four vessels, and um, I'm just looking at the map, and this is very close to like it's Odessa and south of Odessa. It's not far from the Romanian border with where the 101st Airborne U.S. Airborne is, right? Um, the Russians for a long time have been complaining about the way this has been handled, that their grain is not reaching countries that really need it. Instead, it's been diverted to European countries or it's just been held indefinitely. While Ukrainian shipments have been going, as you say, they're toxic, but they're going mostly to Europe. Um, and interestingly, Turkey has come out and said yesterday that the main obstacles to the grain deal that was created with Russia, Turkey, and the UN is the U.S. and the UK. So I thought that was interesting and kind of finally a bold move on the part of the Russians.
I would agree, and it really does come down to they just have to hardball this because at the end of the day, who is going to suffer most from, say, a collapse in food supplies in Africa and the Middle East? It's not going to be Russia. Russia's not going to have to
Hmm.
deal with all these people coming in.
Hmm.
It's going to be mostly Europe. And look, I don't want to see that happen. I don't think that would be a good thing. Now, I think a lot of people in the West think that would be a good thing, especially on the American side, because the Americans, although we would have to bear some of the brunt of that, not as much as the Europeans. And look, the more the Europeans are subjugated and under the thumb of somebody else that isn't their own leadership, the better. I mean, that's what freeing Europe from tyranny is all about. At the end of the day, we can't have the Europeans under their own tyrants. They got to be under our tyrants. We can't have the Europeans under people who, look, may be authoritarian but lead them for their own ends. But they have to be under our authoritarians who lead them to our ends, which means more Merkels and more migrants because that's how. No, no, we can't do Merkel. Merkel's too buddy buddy with the Russians. It's more, gee, who's a good example? I suppose Macron. I guess he'll do play the limperist game. Where like, oh, okay, I'll go to China. I'll do whatever. But then the day he knows where his bread is buttered. He knows who pays the bills. He knows who he's reliant on at the end of the day. And look, I mean, I think that they, of course, the U.S., UK, and company want to stop the grain shipments. They don't care if there's a complete collapse in food supplies in Africa and the Middle East because once again, it gives them yet another migrant crisis. They always love one of those, and it lets them paint the Russians the bad guy. Look, Russia doesn't want to trade with you. Look, Russians are causing another famine in Africa. They're undoing all the decades of progress we've had since 1980, blah, 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 blah. And I think it's honestly right for the Russians to hardball this because there's really no other way. I mean, it's not like they're preventing them from getting the grain because they weren't getting it in the first place. It's already been a nightmare to ship it out of the Black Sea. So the question is that the next piece of leverage? And will the West really give a damn when the starvation starts? And I don't know, the Europeans might when migrants show up on their shores, even some of the more quote unquote moderate Europeans. But it it has the potential to create a very interesting and very escalatory dynamic that I'm not really sure what the clear end of that is.
Yeah, and just to continue with I don't either. I mean, it's an issue, but I think in many ways it was also an optical issue. The Ukrainians right now are very upset with the way Poland has dealt with them over the grain deal, right? This we said on the last show that there's a kind of a normalization process that's taking place where education ministers and historians are meeting in Poland to discuss like mid-century 20th century history for school textbooks in Ukraine, right? Like the thing is right, like I don't think the Ukrainians understand this. This really shows you just how naive they are. Let's say they defeat Russia, right? Like I don't think they understand like all those Bandera statues and paintings, like all of that will go down. The process may take a while. It may be just like, gay marriage or gay pride parades. But I think this bit of news indicates that that is what will happen. I don't think they see that. I think,
Well, we already almost saw this happen because you recall back in 2019 when it looked like the situation was just going to completely freeze over. You had Western media outlets talking about the dangerous neo-Nazi paramilitaries in
yeah,
Ukraine,
yeah, yeah,
and they
yeah.
ran several of those pieces. They talked about their youth training camps, and it looked like they were just going to completely leave Ukraine to the wolves, that they'd completely given up on it. But then
Hmm.
2021 in particular rolled around where it looked like there was going to be a conflict, and then of course 2022 actually brought that conflict, and they had to expunge all of that. They had to turn back to these people in order to galvanize the Ukrainian war effort. But once again, these we've talked about this before. The Azov guys, the Tornado guys, whatever dumb name they have now. I know they're different organizations, but still, the best
Hmm.
they can hope for is to find work as Western private military contractors.
Yeah.
The worst they can hope for is being extradited and tried at the ICC along with Putin. But
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe they'll form a prison gang with old Vlad, and they'll run the entire Hague. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe those are works of fiction, works of fantasy, whatever. And with that, there's really no
Yeah.
future, win or lose, because look, Ukraine as a nation, Ukraine as, and I know we talked about this, as a quote unquote upstart civilization, even though with its massive funding from the outside, it can really be anything. It can't be anything but that. So it simply does not meet that definition.
Hmm.
But still, uh, there's no future for Ukraine, and I think that point needs to be reiterated as many times as it can.
Right, right. The other bit of news that we forgot to do because I think it happened the day or the night before is there was a fab bomb dropped by a Russian plane in Belgorod. Um, like it's a miracle no one died. I saw where like it fell next to the sidewalk on a grassy area, and then it exploded. Like it literally missed cars uh, by 10, 15 meters. Like that doesn't really bode very well for the war effort in terms of perception because there's always something happening, whether it's a terrorist attack. In Melitopol, a policeman was assassinated a day ago. So I mean you can't take care of everything, but Putin has signed into law now. He's gone over a previous law, and now the penalty for treason against Russia is a lifetime. The FSB caught a guy who was plotting in Crimea. So, if you get caught, you're never getting out.
And mind you,
It's
Russia is a nation that, although the death penalty is still in the books, it has effectively suspended it since the 1990s. So even
hmm
they aren't.
hmm
I mean, and perhaps you could say they should be exercising the death penalty in these cases. I would personally be sympathetic to it if I were a Russian, but I mean, because we've seen some of the things that have come out of this. We've seen some of the sabotages that have come out of Crimea and other places along the Russian lines. Even with lifetime in prison, whatever, and with those recent disaster in St. Petersburg that I'm still trying to, frankly, wrap my head around. I don't even think a life imprisonment is enough to deter these kind of things.
Yeah, yeah. Some bit of more Russian news is there was an article in let me see if it was the Washington Post. Ukraine's Azov brigades race to rebuild ahead of fateful fight. Um, it's by someone with the last name Ryan. Sorry, I don't know who wrote this, but in any case, so Ukrainians are ready to seize small Russian cities to use them as leverage to return Russian-controlled territories. This was stated by the Washington Post. The representatives of Azov Battalion banned in the Russian Federation, Bogdan Krotovich. The publication clarifies that for the planned counteroffensive, up to 6.5 thousand recruits are trying to recruit into the unit. The national battalions do not hide the fact that they are ready to immediately put into battle all Azov people who can be returned from Russian captivity, because there are still thousands of um, Ukrainians who are they're captives, they're prisoners of war, and some say at least 1,000 of them are Azov guys. At the time, the brigade commanders complained about the lack of Western ammunition, so on and so on. Um, so it's just funny to me that this story even came about. So they're very brazen about this. Now, last week, Reuters interviewed like one of these guys who are being trained. His call sign is Adolf.
Clearly, after Gustavus Adolphus, I would assume, King of Sweden.
They, yeah, yeah, they literally cannot help themselves. And then I think last July or August, there was an interview with a recruit who was in Azov by the name of Berlin. So he was actually killed today in Bakhmut. So the grinding in Bakhmut is still going on. So, anyways, I just thought that was kind of funny.
Oh no, hilarious! And I just have a couple of other news stories pertaining to Russia before I get too much into Europe. So
hmm
Russia and India continue to strike oil deals above the price cap, which is always good to hear. And once again, there's such a rich irony all of this. Maybe irony isn't the right word, but the fact that India is now one of the largest oil suppliers to Europe, supplying oil from Russia that they do refine there, and it's that the Europeans. Not only is Russia still getting the money, they're getting more of the money, and just in general. And and it's I I have no words for it, but in much more serious news, there was actually a fire in Cyprus
Yeah.
over one of the Russian centers. Now, keep in mind, Russia is pretty entrenched in Cyprus, at least financially. It's their Cayman Islands, for example. It's
Yes.
that's where their wealthy elite commit tax fraud, which is look all the credit to them, the ones that I actually do like. But I mean, Cyprus also a beautiful nation. If I had to commit tax fraud anywhere, I would commit tax fraud in Cyprus. And there was a large fire there. And as far as I understand, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so number one, Cyprus is not a member of NATO. Number two, half their country is occupied by a NATO member, that being Turkey. Number three, when it comes to anti-Russian sentiments in Europe, I don't think the Cypriots really subscribe to it. And I know that you get into the Balkans, you get into Greece, whatever, they are less so on the anti-Russian train, as it were. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't exist entirely, but that also seems pretty divorced from Cyprus. And it's, I mean, what I'm getting at ultimately is I think this is something that is done by outside forces. Now, what is the ultimate aim of all of this? I doubt this is too much of a strategic target. It was a cultural center, but I do think it follows with a general trend in Europe of just trying to divorce it from any sort of even ties to Russia, any sort of even respect or appreciation for Russia, or and like I said, not even like a high respect, but just a basic respect of them as a country and a civilization. You even had a case out of France where they had a Slavic cultural festival, and the Ukrainians were up in arms
Yeah.
because they dared show the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians as fellow East Slavs. So that's where we're at right now. So I don't think, for example, this fire in Cyprus was some sort of big op. I'm sure they probably just ginned up somebody on the ground to torch this place.
Yeah.
But I do think that this is a sign of what's to come in much of Europe. And I think that what we will end up getting out of that is further enmity between Russia and Europe as long as this war goes on. And there's really no way around that. And in terms of a Russia Europe reconciliation, that's really the only thing that can save Europe's relevance going into the next century, through the rest of this century into the next century. But I don't remain optimistic about such prospects. Of course, I never remain optimistic about these sort of prospects. And look, perhaps I need to temper my pessimism sometimes, but Europe just keeps going further and further and further down the drain, and there's really no way around all of this. So, with that being said, I will get into some European news, and I'll tell you, a lot of it coming out of Eastern Europe is not good. And I'll start with probably one of the most telling ones here. So, for starters, Eastern Europe is in a debt crisis as a result of this war. Now, in terms of increase in debts, we have Poland with a 9 billion increase, Hungary, a country that's been adamant about staying neutral in this war, at a 5 billion increase, and Romania at a 6 billion increase in debt. Now, that may sound like nothing to American numbers with our 31 almost 32 trillion dollars in debt, but when you consider the size of these nations and their GDPs, that is a significant chunk of wealth out of their pocket. That is something that they cannot afford if they want to remain economically relevant in any sense. And I don't know how they plan to get around this debt. Now, we all know that the European Union, Brussels, Washington, they could not give less of a damn about any of these countries. That these countries are there to be farmed for resources, quite literally in some cases, and then left to the wolves. They will squeeze every bit of juice they can out of Romania, out of Poland. They'll try to squeeze it out of Hungary. Hungary has some fail safes in place, but once again, Orban isn't going to be around forever. Can his legacy outlive his political career? I hope so. I hope he's established a stable enough apparatus in Hungary to continue on his work, but there's a very real possibility he might not have. We've seen this many times where there's many great leaders who didn't, either because of failure on their own personal part or because of just being unable to because of extenuating circumstance, which I think is probably more the latter in Orban's case, where they cannot secure their legacy. And I fear that that may be a real problem with Hungary going into the future. Now, Romania, which has been an interesting lapdog in this war, had a bit of a scuffle in the parliament that this story has doesn't have too much relevance in terms of the grand scheme of things, but I do think it is quite entertaining, especially given Romania's disposition in this war. And I want to get this name because it's this person deserves all the credit that is due to this. So this was one of the this one is actually about one of the figures out of the Romanian community in Ukraine, and this is in what was once known as Bukovina, has asked the Romanian government to do more to defend the Romanian community, and they are concerned about the once again the language law in Ukraine, and that this new round, an addition to that law, would see 20% of the school curriculum in Ukrainian and go from 20 to 80% of the school curriculum in Ukrainian. And keep in mind, Romanians have been in this area for about 500 years at this point. So these aren't recent migrants. This isn't a Kosovo situation where they just showed up one day 50 years ago and decided that this has always been Romanian land. No, they've been here far longer than the Ukrainians have. And look, I know you can talk about right of conquest and who actually owns what land, whatever. But still, at the end of the day, this is Ukraine being so insecure in itself as a nation that they're going to take this small minority of Romanians in their country and effectively ethnically cleanse them. I would say when you want to take a people and completely enculturate them into your own by those sort of means, it is an ethnic cleansing, and I don't think there's really any two ways about this. And as much as people like to kvetch about Russia, Russia does far more to give protections to its constituent minority languages. I mean, there's a reason why Chechnya can act like Chechnya. There's a reason why there's still a Tatar population in Russia. And look, maybe you could say, oh, well, they should have done well, whatever, whatever. Point being is, you can still run an effective civilization with minority groups living there. And look, it's not like there's a disproportionate amount of Chechens in the Russian government, a disproportionate amount of Tatars. Now, maybe they are, maybe I could be wrong. And perhaps maybe they are given too many rights by the Russian Federation in terms of regionalism and how they can behave compared to the other regions, oblast, whatever. That's not what this is about. But on top of that, you had one of the her name escapes me, one of the far rightist, quote unquote far rightist parliamentarians in Ukraine shouting glory to Russia when it came to the topic of Ukraine and demanding that Ukraine returns Bukovina and that Moldova also be returned to Romania. So, but in terms of what the Romanian state is actually doing, it's a much less, much less of a pleasant picture. So, there are unverified reports that 6 Leopard tanks and 24 T-72s have been transferred from Romania to Ukraine, and these were allegedly spotted heading towards the Ukrainian border. So we have Romania, which has actually per capita given more supplies and trained more soldiers for Ukraine than Poland has. But speaking of Poland, you have an interesting story out of there where the Russian embassy and Russian trade mission out of Poland has had their finances completely seized by the Polish government. And look, in any other time, this would have been something that would have drawn countries into war. This is a huge development because, look, we've had the expulsion of Russian diplomats, we've had the ambassador phoned, whatever. This kind of thing always happens. But when you actually go in and expropriate their funds from their trade mission and their embassy, which are supposed to be fostering goodwill between these nations, at least keeping them from going to war, that's a sign that they're done with negotiations. And that's on top of the speculation that Poland is gearing up for a more proper entrance into this war. And I think we could see that, especially if this is the case, if this goes further, if there are further provocations against the embassy and the trade mission. Perhaps they're trying to provoke Russia into acting first so they can cry Article 5. But even if not, even if that's not what the end game is here, what we're looking at here is they're completely cutting off any channels of communication with Russia, either diplomatically or economically, which more often than not, you look at historical trends, signals that there will be some sort of conflict emerging in the near future.
Right. I mean, there's a bit of news that came out. I believe it was on the 23rd. Um, so the U.S. is saying, I don't know if it's coming directly out of the Biden White House, uh, but it's saying it's ready to reconnect Russian banks to SWIFT if it will benefit the grain deal. I mean, that's a pretty big concession if they did that, right? Optically, that would be pretty bad. I mean, it can be forgotten, but it's an interesting headline. We've already spoken about the grain deal. Maybe Russia blocking these areas is a sign. Maybe the decision will be made because because of course, look, this generation of elites in Europe, they are completely committed to the Americans, and I think those in second or third slots are as well. So I wouldn't hold out like a lot of hope for change there, but it may be that more will be required of the Europeans later. And if there's too much domestic unrest and refusal to support the war more than they are now, that could spell big troubles for the U.S.
Yes, and I'm shocked that even the question of reintegrating Russia into SWIFT even came up. I thought that ship had sailed. I thought that they were not
Mm,
going to do that, which shows that although it is ideal for them, they are still determined to bring Russia back into the fold and aren't committed to full balkanization. Now, balkanization is the ideal outcome. The complete collapse of Russia into several smaller states is the ideal outcome, but it shows that they're willing to forego that, at least temporarily. I mean, I do think that would be their ultimate goal in all of this, if it means getting this grain deal through, which shows, I would say, a very significant amount of concern that I would not have attributed to them because I figured they were willing to let this crisis fester a bit, but I don't know, maybe they are concerned that Europe can't bear another migrant wave. So,
mm.
which you even had people like Merkel and Macron and whatever take what are half measures at best against the migration crisis because they realize that if we keep doing this, either the countries are going to collapse or the dreaded far right is going to assume power. And there's no real other options with that. And of course, both of those are just as fatal to the American empire's hold in Europe as the other. But getting on to more renegade stories out of the American Empire, we do have a bit of news out of Hungary. And starting with their army chief has been completely sacked in their latest shakeup, as insider paper would call it. And Orban has embraced the legacy of Stalin. He's purging his officers. He's a tyrant. Once again, the Europeans can't be ruled by their own authoritarians. They got to be ruled by our authoritarians. So
Mm.
this came after a law in January that would allow the defense minister to dismiss anyone over the age of 45 in terms of the high command. And they said they want to quote unquote rejuvenate the armed forces. Now, the pro Western opposition is saying that this is targeted at purging pro NATO and pro LGBTQ CIA empire loyalists from the Hungarian military, which it probably is, if we're being honest. Not that that's a bad thing, but the opposition is probably more correct than the government here in terms of what's being said. Now, I think it would be funny if Orban's government outright said, yeah, we're purging the pro NATO officers, but of course that cannot be done. And this was the dismissal of. Let me try to pronounce this name. My Hungarian is impeccable, as I'm sure you all know. This is the dismissal of Lieutenant General Romulus Ruzin Sznezdy, who was commander of the Hungarian Defense Forces, and that was officiated by President Caitlin Novak, who was also part of the Fidesz party, a political ally of Orban. Now, the presidency is a much more symbolic position in Hungary, but it still does have quite a bit of executive power. And unlike a lot of countries, the presidency and the prime minister and their cabinet are all on the same page here. Hungary is effectively a one-party state. Not that I mean, it's a good party to be a one-party state, but that's what it is in reality. And Snesny, Gruzin Snesny, once again impeccable Hungarian, was the youngest commander at age 46 when he was appointed by Janos Ader in 2019. So far the current replacement slated is Gabor Burundi. See, look, Burundi. That's one of those other. You can see how I could get the Cavoli being Hungarian, right? Just to return to that.
Yeah.
It's, I I feel vindicated yet again. And he's currently Hungary's military representative to the EU and NATO. Now, Ruzin Snesdy has not been dismissed from the armed forces altogether, just from this current post. He will be remaining. And I think that this shows, once again, I think the opposition is actually completely right here, that Hungary is trying to completely expunge, well, maybe not completely, but to a large degree expunge pro NATO elements from the military, that they do fear that there may be some sort of, if not outright coup, because I don't think Hungary would have an outright coup, that there would be at least subversion of the Hungarian government's aims politically in relation to the Ukraine war, and that would be something that would have to be dealt with. And look, I don't know what sort of tensions may have happened leading up to this, but he's out, and this is a very positive trend I hope to see continue in Hungary and elsewhere. And look, I could see, say, Slovakia doing much the same. I could see maybe even a Bulgaria or wherever else follow suit with this. These small nations of, let's just say, these small, I wouldn't exactly call them distant because they're all still pretty much in line with the American Empire, with the possible exception of Hungary. But these, let's just say, renegade nations to the American Empire, we could see a trend here. Even Romania could throw us a curveball, and we could see them dismiss some officers. But this is something that I do hope to see continuing, and something that I do think will bring down the ire of the usual suspects upon Hungary. And that's also combined with some other news out of Hungary, in which Orban does keep pushing the bill, which, hey, I'll give him all the credit in the world for. So, this is involving justice reforms, and it would remove the authorities' ability to challenge final verdicts at the Hungarian Constitutional Court, removing quote unquote obstacles for Hungarian judges to refer to EU tribunals if the there's any discord between Hungarian and EU laws. So that has also been a topic of dispute in Poland. Hungary has also faced some sort of backlash, some sort of internal punishments within the European Union for pursuing this. However, they are less likely to have balked. It does seem like justice reforms are the way to go when it comes to Israel, whatever, in order to really secure power. Because it looks like that people are finally starting to realize the power of the law of the judiciary as opposed to the legislature and executive and other, and I mean even the bureaucracy at that point. I'd say the law has even a bit of an edge over the some of the bureaucracies. But the Hungarian Justice Minister Judith Farga announces that Hungary has reached partial agreement with the European Union over the justice reforms. If the Commission were to approve this, the agreement alone would free up 13 billion of the total 22 billion of frozen assets that the European Union froze as a result of this. So it does look like that they're willing to give some concessions to Hungary in this regard. Now, perhaps they feel that they cannot strong arm European Union nations too much, especially given how unstable the situation is, where they are willing to give at least some degree of concessions. Now, 13 out of 22 isn't the worst in the world, but once again, you're still sitting on $9 billion of Hungarian funds, and I believe that was 5 billion Hungary accrued in debt as a result of this war. So, just to put those numbers into perspective when it comes to the size of the Hungarian economy, I don't have GDP figures off the top of my head, but I can imagine that it they're hurting because of it. So, we do potentially
Hmm.
have a solution to that, and what actually looks like a concession on Brussels' part, which is always good to see.
Yes. We're just going to have to see how, like, I mean, there are different factions, and I think there are factions that are very worried about if things don't go right in 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 Ukraine, and what will be the fallout for Europe. Just as I think that there are at least two different forces struggling in the US, I think the same thing is happening in Europe, but it all depends on, like, that's what makes the situation so dangerous, is even this sort of small amount of loss of power by the US. And in a way, like, the US degrades its own prestige by prolonging this war, and why it must come out victorious, because the longer it drags on, the more countries are not siding with it, but they're actively working within that China Russia complex.
Oh no, we'll have
So,
some news about the continued de-dollarization in Brazil and others when
yeah.
it comes to later in the show, but it's the American empire has shown itself to be, once again, to be America's friend is fatal. There is really
Mm,
no two ways about it when it comes to what we're witnessing right now, and we'll get into some of the news in the Middle East in a little bit here that would also go down that same road. But just to continue out of Europe, we do have some interesting statements from the Speaker of the Parliament in Slovakia. Once again, Slovakia, one of the more renegade nations out of the European Union, and not so much pro-Russia but pro-China. So the Speaker of Parliament, Boris Karlar, has said that, quote, China is certainly one of those countries which we have a lot to learn, especially in terms of economic and technological maturity. So you do have avenues developing in Europe where, although Russia has been mostly cut off, that close economic relations with China still do persist. And it was on the eve of 2021 that the European Union and China signed the largest trade deal in both their histories between each other. And it's going to create a great deal of tensions when the Taiwan conflict does pick up, because even a lot of Western European nations have great economic investment and interests in maintaining at least a workable relationship with China. Thought the European energy crisis was bad vis-a-vis Russia. We're in for yet another, probably an economic depression in Europe if they were expected to implement even a fraction of the measures against China that they have against Russia. Now, I'm not saying the Europeans are wholly reliant on China, but they're large trade partners, especially the European Union as an entire organization and China. Whereas the combination of both Russia and China being cut off from Europe is going to be a complete disaster for the continent. Even, let's just say, war in Ukraine never happens. We have China Taiwan war instead. Europeans still continue to buy Russian energy at a reasonable price. In fact, that would have actually benefited the Europeans, seeing industry leave China, go back to Europe, whatever, while they have a cheap form of Russian energy. That could have been a great boon to them. But what we have now is them cut off from Russian energy and raw materials, combined with a potential cut off from Chinese financial power. And Europe is on the road to, look. I said they were complete irrelevance right now, on the road to complete irrelevance right now with their, even with their current relationship with China. But once that falls through, it's going to be, and look, I don't use this term lightly. It's going to be a complete dark age in Europe. There is going to be, and not just in a literal sense in terms of not being able to keep the lights on, but it's going to be a
Mhm, mhm.
complete implosion of Europe. These countries are going to be, look, I don't want to be too drastic about this, but we might see substantial civilizational decline in real material senses, not just the higher sense. Now, we have seen degradation of infrastructure, et cetera, which is all important, but in terms of complete dysfunction in European nations, we would see that if they were cut off from China, which is probably going to happen within the next decade. And I don't really see any way around that, unless there is some spectacular Russian win, a rapprochement between Russia and Europe within the next 10 years. A severance of China from Europe is going to be the death knell of the continent.
Mhm, mhm.
And I would imagine, now perhaps I was wrong because I said at the beginning of this war that, or even in the prelude to this war, that, well, the Europeans are going to be a lot more pragmatic about this. They got to watch their own bottom line at the end of the day, and they're probably not going to completely cut themselves off from Russian energy. And while they have not completely cut themselves off from Russian energy, they've cut themselves off far beyond what I would have ever expected. They completely kneecap themselves in the interest of the American empire. And I would think the same thing, that at the end of the day, they got to respect their own bottom line, that they're going to maintain some relation with China, even if there is conflict over Taiwan or wherever else, or the South China Sea, or uh, pick the hot spot of the day, I guess. But even then, I genuinely don't know if the Europeans would be able to look out for their own bottom line. And would that be the final straw for the European populations? Because, I mean, they've shown that they're willing to put up with a lot of abuse. And just the past, what, 5 years alone, and that's not saying it didn't happen before them, but just the past 5 years alone, I think 5 to 10 years alone would show that. But I don't understand how they expect to keep Europe online and not completely collapse into irrelevance, which would not be good for the American empire. That they need Europe to at least keep its head barely above the water. So, what exactly is the plan here to keep Europe solvent in any sense of the word?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Was this worth keeping the American dollar in top spot? Because the euro has fallen in value. Um,
The euro has
uh,
fallen.
yeah, I mean
Billions
it
must be
has.
liquidated.
Billions must be liquidated. Yeah. Now I know that there were some statements earlier this week about futures for like the bank and the sorry, the Russian economy. Let me just find it if you don't mind.
Oh no, no problem.
Oh, oh, by the way, the president of Czech Republic was in Kiev. Of course, if like an idiot, I forgot to mention there have been two massive missile strikes by the Russians this week, and he had to go into the basement of one of the hotels in downtown. Because Kiev and the surrounding area of Kiev, but also areas like, as I mentioned earlier, Nikolaev, Poltava, the Kharkov region, particularly in the south. There's a lot of groupings there. Uh, Several other areas were targeted. Um, so, anyways, I just as I'm looking for this article, please forgive me.
Yeah, it's no problem. But
Anyways, I mean, it's basically projecting that the Russian economy will do much better. It already survived very well, um, all things considered, and it continues to get forecasts that essentially say that the Russian economy will get even better next year. So, um, you know, the, who would have believed? I mean, I really was not confident when this war started last year where Russia's economy would end up. I knew, like, in many ways, that the Russians were more prepared than 2014, and that the claims that it would hamper their that the sanctions would hamper their military industrial complex were not true. That the those things happened more in the 2014, 2015 sanctions, but again, they're doing better than I thought, and this this slow grinding war has really worked out to Russia's advantage. Not that there aren't losses, of course not. There are, and not that it hasn't created problems. It has, but Russia's. Uh, I mean, the West wasn't prepared for this. That's why they're giving all these weapon systems piecemeal and rapidly trying to train young Ukrainian men who are dying in the thousands to go fight because they were not prepared for this outcome. If they were prepared for an attritional warfare, they already would have invested in many factories. Even if they all had to be in the U.S., they would have invested in many of them to shore up munitions. But that didn't happen because they misjudged this war.
and perhaps you could say, while I'm certain Russia did prepare and they did prevent themselves from completely collapsing because of sanctions, that their economy is actually doing far better than they expected and actually doing decently just in normal everyday terms.
Yeah,
I would say a lot of it is due to under preparation on the part of Ukraine and the West as a whole, as you were saying, that they were not
yeah.
prepared to dig in for this kind of war of attrition. They wanted to have this meat grinder, but they did not have the supplies and resources to support said meat grinder. And
R- yes,
and it's
yes, and
it's too late to set that up now. What's the plan now?
I know. And again, that's what makes the situation so dangerous. So I found the rating agency projects Russia's bank's net profit of 31.7 billion in 2023. In the first quarter of this year, Russian banks already earned a total of 881 billion rubles. Russian banks' net profit will exceed 2 trillion rubles. Okay, I mean, that's a lot less than, but you know, their economy is structured very differently. Many amenities are very affordable, like, food, transportation, all that kind of stuff. And they have healthcare. So, Plus, since the last show, the Russian economy's inflation has dropped another half percentage point. So it's only 2.5% inflation. That's way like,
That's a normal level of inflation.
yeah,
As compared to what some of the 8-9% you get out of, as a conservative estimate, out of places like Lithuania and Estonia. That's insane.
right.
That's insane.
Germany, Britain,
Oh, phew.
yeah, yeah.
And that's assuming some of the figures they even say are not lowballs, which I think they almost always are. Now,
Hmm.
to get on to some of the last European news I had, we have a bit of news out of Serbia and Bosnia. So, Serbia held military exercises called Granite 2023, and they had their parachute brigades and the standard military exercises, and it was all the lights and sounds and the optics that you like. But this is on top of rising tensions in Bosnia. So in Bosnia, there are calls for the Serbian Republic leader Dodnik to start to take a much more adversarial stance towards the government, and he has instituted former armed border control crossings to close itself off from Bosnia proper. And they have now, perhaps it's a bit sensationalist, but there are reports that they are moving to call themselves an independent entity from the state of Bosnia. So Milorad Dodik, which the aforementioned president said on their state TV channel that the existence of the Serbian Republic as part of Bosnia was imposed on the outside by the Federation itself and does not intend to resort to forceful methods and wants to solve this issue through diplomacy. But there is a breakdown in the very fragile unity happening in Bosnia right now. And this has been going on for a number of years. You could argue that it never really stopped since the end of the war, that this was a very tentative peace. But on top of the tensions with Kosovo, with Montenegro, and now with Bosnia, I do think that a flare up in the Balkans is something that some people, actually on both sides, do want, especially on the side of the American Empire, because they know at this point Russia cannot support Serbia. They know it's much like the 1990s, where Serbia would be very much on its own. Maybe not as bad as the 1990s, but in a large degree would be on its own if any sort of conflict were to break out. And I will say once again, the Brits have had planned for years, the MI6 had planned for years, that they will take out several key figures within the Bosnian Serb leadership upon the outbreak of a conflict. And really, I think conflict between the Bosnians and the Serbs is actually a lot more likely than Kosovo right now, because I think the situation with Kosovo is very tenuous. And you could actually argue that's why Vucic has taken the very pussyfooting position, you could say, towards Kosovo, because there is anticipation of a conflict out of Bosnia that takes precedent over that, because it is a much hotter situation, which I would agree with. I don't think his moves on Kosovo are justified, however, but I would still agree with that general assessment that that's what could be happening right now. And look, perhaps this is another nothing burger. We see this kind of thing all the time. We see this where there'll be tensions and then just overnight they'll disappear. And they've speculated on the collapse of Bosnia for quite some time now, but Bosnia as a political entity is just completely unstable. It doesn't make any sense. It's not part of the EU, it's not part of NATO. It's just this rump state that exists as an American military base, effectively. So the question is, have the pieces been set into place for a reignition of the conflict in the Balkans? Because we have the situation where Russia could not bail out Serbia, but we also have a position where the American Empire really is going to have to pick and choose its battles, because it's already struggling with Ukraine. It wants to orient itself towards Taiwan. We already see escalating tensions with Iran in the Middle East again, with the U.S. moving bunker buster capable aircraft into the Middle East within striking distance of Iran. So perhaps the Bosnian Serbian leadership is looking at this and saying that, well, if there's a time where we could do this with the American Empire completely distracted, now is the time. So we're going to capitalize on this opportunity. Now, once again, Dodik said he was not interested in war, which I doubt that he is. But the question is he willing to resort to armed conflict? I really don't know. I don't know about enough about him to know if he would be able to or willing to take those sort of actions. But perhaps he's willing to raise the issue right now because the American Empire and Europe are so distracted by other fronts.
Well, I mean, Dodik has essentially said that he's pulling out. He doesn't recognize Bosnia in his current um, constituency, and he wants to rejoin Republika Srpska to Serbia proper. Um, these are big words. He's being very provocative. Um, in a sense, it's forcing NATO to divide not only between its attention to Ukraine, but is it going to be Ukraine, Kosovo, or Bosnia? So it's acting as a counterbalance. Um, like I say, it could just be a bluff. It just, but I mean, those Serbs, I've met some of those Serbs from that region of Republika Srpska in Bosnia, and they're extremely patriotic. And this is something that they've wished for a very long time.
And
And
I mean, I can only speak from personal experience, but in terms of my interactions with the Serbs, the Bosnian Serbs are much more fervent about these sort of issues than the ones living in Serbia proper.
yeah, yeah, and I think part of it is because it's a more rural setting in comparison, and they've had to fight more directly with Croats and Muslims in that area. So I think it's to be expected. Also, like all urban centers, there's a certain amount of shit liberty. So you can expect that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, but
Yeah,
like you said, I think it's a much more immediate concern to them than Serbia as a whole. But
yeah,
you do make an interesting point that does serve as a counterbalance. That if they do have the potential of conflict in the Balkans, the Americans are of course going to have to keep an eye on that as well, on top of Ukraine and on top of the situation in China with Taiwan. So perhaps once again, I doubt there's too much direct coordination. I doubt Putin's giving marching orders from the Kremlin to Serbia and Republika Srpska. I mean, some people might believe that, but I don't personally.
yeah. I don't
Just,
think so.
and I know the exact kind of people who would believe that, but that's not really relevant right now. But once again, it is a capitalization on the situation where, and perhaps they're using it and they're using the pre-existing pressures in order to secure a more diplomatic solution to this. And
And actually, interestingly, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
no, no, go
Vucic
ahead.
was
You,
rushed to hospital.
yeah,
Vucic was rushed to hospital.
yes, much like Erdogan, which we'll get
Yeah,
into a bit here. And uh, I don't know if that's still a forbidden word on YouTube, but let's just say it's a certain condition after you undergo a certain medical treatment that was
yeah.
very
It affects the
coercive.
cardiovascular
Yeah,
system. It seems.
yeah. Don't ask me for the name of it. I couldn't think of it for the life of me. Of course not. Wink, wink,
But
nudge, nudge. But
to be fair to this to Susan on YouTube,
of course,
he was diagnosed with this issue back in late 2019. So I don't know.
well, yeah, it might. Fair enough. Now, the one with Erdogan is much more suspicious, but that's aside the point.
Yes.
Now, and the last piece of European news I will leave on is we don't have much out of this, but the Greek government has collapsed and is heading to elections within the next few months. I don't know if they have announced a date for that yet, but that is probably not going to change much the grand scheme of things. But hey, another Southern European government collapsed. That's some real news right there. These parliamentary systems are very stable, as I'm sure you know, and I mean, it, I mean,
Yeah, their
I,
instability
I
creates a
just
stability all their own.
I just think it's funny that there's not a single country with a Mediterranean coastline that can make a parliamentary system of government work. And I'm not saying that's like to the fault of any of these countries because when, once again, like I'm talking Spain, Italy, Greece, even like Israel, whatever. But I'm just saying the one with the most, let's just say, continuity of government upon the Mediterranean, I would probably just have to say it's funny enough Turkey. It's a very centralized presidential system. So I'm just saying certain groups of people might not be built for certain forms of government. And I can say that Meds are, and look, I'll just put it this way: Turks are not Meds; they're Asiatics. But I didn't say, I did not say that. Cut that from the record, please. Cut that from the record, please. But I'm getting off track here. But point being is, I don't think Meds are built for parliamentary government. I don't think it's too much of dramatic autism for them. I'll just put it that way. They just it just overloads us. Look, I can speak as somebody with hailing from, at least in part, that region, ancestrally speaking, at least. But I'm getting sidetracked. We're going to get into some Middle Eastern news right here. And I'm not going to start directly with the Turkish elections and Erdogan's rushing to the hospital and the subsequent news following that, but I'm going to start with some news out of Syria. So, there were more Israeli strikes in Syria over the course of the past week, and let me just read exactly what I have here. So, just to pull up the notes here. And these strikes were on these strikes were on the
Homs, I think.
yes, on Homs on April 25th. And Syrian anti-aircraft were activated, uh, and there were also strikes over the Golan Heights where Syrian air defenses were activated. So we do see Israel continuing to lash out against Syria and other countries as its own political stability does continue to erode. Oh, also, I can't believe I forgot to mention this. I got so caught up on the Turkish question that no, the Israeli Ashkenazim are also not Meds. Okay, that also needs to be still neither. Okay, neither the Sephardim. I refuse to give that, and certainly not the Mizrahim. But I'm not going to get into Israeli ethnic politics at least right now. That'll come at a later date possibly. But in Syria proper, we do have some disputes between the residual Turkish forces and Syrian farmers. So there were hundreds of Syrian farmers that blocked the path of Turkish engineering equipment in the north of the country, preventing them from digging trench lines along the border with Turkey. And local authorities said that Turkish troops are taking away agricultural lands from the residents in attempts to create a security zone. So while there is the process of reconciliation and peace happening between Turkey and Syria right now, the issues are far from resolved. As it stands now, Erdogan and Assad are still slated to meet in Moscow with Putin in order to hammer out some of the finer points of this agreement. Now, we're also coming up on the Turkish elections, so that is going to be something that could drastically affect this outcome. Now, as it stands, the current opposition is rather similar in terms of policy as Erdogan. And it's interesting because the primary issue isn't necessarily Turkey's stance towards Russia or whatever else, because even the opposition party still supports the energy cooperation with Russia, still supports the economic cooperation with Russia, and, quote, wants to find a peaceful solution beneficial to both sides in the Ukraine conflict. But in terms of their territorial claims with their fellow NATO states, is actually where it gets a lot more interesting when it comes to the Turkish elections. So, look, I have no doubt that they want Erdogan out, and this isn't necessarily a defense or singing the praises of the man, but he has become rather troublesome for the Western powers in the past couple of years, and it goes back even further than that, certainly. But even if, say, the opposition generally toes the same line on cooperation with Russia and stances towards the West, whatever, keep in mind Turkey has taken a sharp anti-Western turn in, I would say, at least since the Iraq War. That's only festered since. But with that, even if you get Erdogan out of power, that still creates a power vacuum, which could create the way for a completely pro-Western color revolution regime. So they may cast their lots with the opposition, even if that does mean increasing tensions between Turkey and its NATO neighbors, such as Greece, of course, Bulgaria, even getting into some parts of, now I know they're not NATO, but even some parts of the Cyprus question. So the elections in Turkey, while the effects may not be immediately seen, we may see a situation where long term down the road this could create some real tension between the two. And that's on top of Erdogan being rushed to the hospital with issues relating to heart health. So that happened earlier this week, and then he was very quickly discharged and was back out on the campaign trail again. But he seemed very stunted as a result of this. He seemed very devoid
Mm,
of energy. Now, the man, of course, just recovered from some sort of medical issue, but there's a difference between that and showing that this issue might not be completely resolved. And what exactly this was, we're still not sure. Now, maybe you can say it was the CIA heart attack gun, whatever. But whether this was somebody trying to poison him with something or some other health issue, either way, it does not bode well for Erdogan. Now, his popularity isn't the worst in the world. It beats a lot of Western leaders, I'll give it that much. But he has been, of course, a very bombastic and controversial leader, both at home and abroad. And the question is, will they keep with him? Will they continue on with him? I still think, as it stands now, he has the election in the bag, but we could also see a situation where it's a post-election outrage. We've seen this in other countries before, where they will have the elections, they'll go off without a hitch, and then I think Belarus is an example of this. Now, I'm not saying the Belarusian elections are the pinnacle of honesty. Granted, neither are any elections if you really get down to brass tacks. But it could be Erdogan wins with whatever margins the opposition challenges, and they destabilize the country through post-election protests, which I think is probably the most likely scenario going forward with that. But it will remain to be seen. The elections are next month, and I will just get the exact date for the first rounds of the Turkish elections right here because it is a two-tier system. Now, the opposition is slightly ahead in a second round election, so that would be, I mean, but it's only by a few points, so you can only trust polls so much. And those elections will take place on Sunday, May 14th, which is about 2 weeks from now. Let me just pull that up to get my math right. Yeah, that would be two
Thursday, I
weeks from
think.
tomorrow, as the time we're recording on a Saturday.
Mm.
So they'll probably go to a second round if I had to imagine, but I think Erdogan generally hasn't. I think we'll see a lot of the instability come actually as a result of the election being called in his favor or not in his favor, rather than any lead up to the elections. I think the elections will largely go off without a hitch, but the fallout of said elections will be major regardless of the result.
Yeah, I know that the U.S. has already spoken with his opposition, who is a Kemalist. I mean, if Erdogan loses, I think I've always said this that the war in Ukraine could take a very different turn. It depends on like it depends on the leadership and how much it considers the policies that Erdogan has introduced are actually worth keeping, and how much is it going to follow Europe, right? Um, so that remains to be seen. Now, Erdogan signed the biggest. Um, Erdogan signed the biggest investment in Russia-Turkey relations so far, and that is a nuclear power plant. there were I saw photos from a conference where they have a model of this thing, and it's in, very high tech looking and so on. So this is a pretty big deal, and that's what I mean about, like, do they really want to give up on this, right? Um, Stuff like that might be scrapped, just the way it's not certain now in Sudan whether there will be a Russian base built on the Red Sea. Um, so, that remains to be seen. Now, his opposition is ahead, but not like way ahead. And curiously, the earthquake did not hurt Erdogan's polls as badly as people thought. He was still ahead when they were polling in all of February and March, but the turn seems to have taken place like after his health went into question. Even then, his the opposition was catching up. There's a Kurdish political party as well that has asked all Kurds to vote for the Kemalist, which is ironic, right? Um, so, like you say, it's uncertain right now what's going to happen, but I think in terms of the war effort, it's going to be really important that Erdogan wins. I never thought doing this show all these years that I would say something like that, and yet here we are.
Well, it's funny because I've had this conversation with a lot of people who are, once again, generally in line with what we believe. And look, they've done the math, as it were, and look, Erdogan is actually the least bastardly bastard of the bastards who are running, and it's a shocking scenario, I know. And look, as far as I'm concerned, the Turks can all go back to. No, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to say that on air. I'm not going to say that on air. They can go back to their homes and their families and live normal lives like the rest of us because we live in a world of liberal democracy where everyone has their rights. Blah. See, okay, but I think you all know where they should go back to. If I were saying this on a Telegram exclusive show, I'll just put it that way. But I will not. I will not be too inflammatory for the time being because I try to stay out of trouble, but I can't help myself sometimes. But as it stands now, the least bad option is Erdogan, and
Yes, yes, that's a good way of putting
like
it.
maintain the status quo would be the best thing possible because as you were saying, I do think that if we were to get a now, although the Kemalist opposition does at least claim to maintain the same foreign policy, we could see how they might be bended against that if they were to actually take power because stated policy versus effective policy are two very, very different things. But when it comes to that, we could see a scenario in which Turkey throws its weight behind Ukraine, turns the Black Sea into a lake effectively by blocking the Bosphorus to Russian access, and begins opening up the arms stockpiles to Ukraine, that could completely reinvigorate the war effort. Now, I'm not saying that's a guarantee for Ukrainian victory, but it can be a lot more painful process for Russia to win this war, and it could be something where they are going to have to commit a lot more than what they originally did, and also have to look
Hmm.
out for a potential front in the south as well, because once again, the Kemalist opposition is also fully behind the Azeri provocations in Armenia. So we could see a situation where if they are swayed to a more pro-Western policy, they could inflame the situation in the Caucasus even more because that would only serve to detriment Russia, serve to Russia's detriment. But it's a very potential dangerous situation where somehow Erdogan is the peace candidate, and I think that says a lot. Things are really messed up if that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, it is the case. I mean, I think Erdogan knows like what's best for him. I think you could even extrapolate and say what's maybe best for Turkey as well going forward. After a year of watching like the course that Europe has taken, he has to be thinking, right? He has to be thinking we might end up going this way as well.
Oh, they're completely willing to scull the ship everywhere. We've seen
Yeah.
them do it to Europe, and I have to say another country, which I don't have any particular news about, but I think is worth mentioning given some of their foreign policy intricacies, that Japan has to be looking at all of this and thinking
Hmm.
that, well, we're effectively under the same colonial agreements as Germany is, and the American Empire, in their infinite generosity, has allowed us to buy oil from the Sakhalin pipeline, so long as we go pay Zelensky a visit in Kiev or Kiev. I'm sorry, I need to get those proper pronunciations as set forth by the Associated Press because they're a very prestigious organization that I put, frankly, a large amount of stock into. But that's aside the point. But you have that, and it's just uh, the signing of a signature on a document that stops oil flowing from the Sakhalin pipeline to Japan. And the Japanese have fared decently as a result of the economic fallout of this war. And not to mention, they possibly have a war in their backyard. I know that the Japanese have several outstanding issues with the Chinese, but they're also major economic partners, and their economic relationship has only grown in the recent years. And you even had the now late Shinzo Abe make several overtures to China, which is it was he was a very interesting figure in that regard. He didn't really have a side when it came to any of this. He was very pro-Western when he needed to be. He would go to China when he needed to be. He would cooperate with the Russians. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's why they took him out. Who knows? I think that assassination it very quickly disappeared from the public consciousness. But I think that might be worth diving back into at some point. But point being is the Japanese state leadership still has not deviated much. The same party's still in power. But also, once again, the Japanese have to be looking at this situation, and I think Turkey also has to be looking at the situation where uh, I think I have our episode title to be America's friend is fatal. Yeah, I think that's it right there. But at the end of the day, it's hitching your wagons to a system where, look, Russia and China may not be the most benevolent powers that, and it may come back to bite them. But point being is, they can either take the non-0% chance the situation will get better, or continue persisting down the same course, which will lead to certain destruction. And that's really the option for these countries at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But more news out of the Middle East. We have more Chinese involvement there. So, according to the Washington Post, take that for what you will, American spies detected construction of a suspected Chinese military facility in the United Arab Emirates in December, 1 year after Washington's oil rich ally announced it was halting the project because of U.S. concerns, according to top secret intelligence docs. That's how you know it's real. Now, China, as we know, has been investing heavily into the Middle East, particularly into the Arabian Peninsula. It has facilitated very successful talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the past several months. And they've had their share of economic investments in all of those countries, even before Iran and Saudi Arabia began this process of the reconciliation. China still had a lot of money in Saudi Arabia. And really, that's exactly what it is. The money was too good, the business was too good, so it's time to make peace and bury the hatchet with the Iranians. But on top of that, they've also expanded their military presence. They've had that one naval base off the Horn of Africa for years. I think that one is in the Booty, but I can't remember exactly where that is. And they've been interested in expanding in that region for quite some time now. And especially upon the dawn of a new era of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia and a complete de escalation in the Middle Eastern region, barring some parts of maybe Syria at this point, we do see potential where the Emiratis probably have agreed to let the Chinese continue with their base, even despite American objections, but keeping it covert. So, although it's top secret Pentagon documents by the Washington Post, I actually am inclined to believe this one. I am inclined to believe that China has an even greater foothold, militarily speaking, in the Middle East than they did even just a few months ago, and that this is a trend that's going to continue. The Americans will eventually be eclipsed in military presence in the Middle East by China, because once again, as it stands now, China's foreign policy is pro-business. China's foreign policy is to bring home money, and they'll need military assets in the region for some reason the U.S. did to protect trade interests there, to ensure the oil gets shipped there, and especially naval assets because I can't imagine the Chinese are going to be too reliant on American vessels to guard their oil shipments back home from the Gulf now. I can't see that kind of arrangement working. So the Chinese Navy will probably have to take up protection of their own vessels here. And speaking of protections of vessels, one of the other major news stories out of the Middle East, as happened this week, was the seizure of an oil tanker belonging to the U.S. in the Gulf of Oman by Iranian forces. So, from U.S. Naval Command Fifth Fleet in the Gulf of Oman on April 27th, approximately 1:15 p.m. local time, Marshall Islands Flight oil tanker Advantage Suite was seized by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, while transiting in international waters in the Gulf of Oman. The oil tanker issued a distress call during the seizure. U.S. Fifth Fleet is monitoring the situation. Iran's actions are contrary to international law and disrupt the regional security and stability. The Iranian government should immediately release the oil tanker. Iran's continued harassment of vessels and interference in navigational rights in regional waters is a threat to maritime security and the global economy. I wonder who else is a threat to the global economy. That's an interesting question. The past 2 years, Iran has unlawfully seized at least 5 commercial vessels sailing in the Middle East. So, while, of course, I doubt the Iranians are going to seize any Chinese vessels anytime soon, we do see this tit for tat game where the Americans will seize the Iranian vessels, the Iranians will seize the American vessels, and I doubt that Chinese sailors are too interested in sending out distress calls to the Fifth Fleet. Maybe 20 years ago they would have. Maybe even 10 years ago they would have. But now, I'm certain they want a Chinese fleet to respond to any sort of crises that may emerge because of that, whether it's some sort of proxy state actor through the U.S., whether it's the U.S. seizing Chinese vessels. I think it would require a great deal of escalation if the U.S. were going to be seizing any Chinese vessels personally, but it's still not out of the realm of possibility. But as a result of this, the U.S. has sanctioned not only the IRGC, but also the Russian FSB, trying to tie this all the way back to Russia when it comes to the seizure of the oil tankers. So, American prestige, once again, is being completely eroded as we speak. And, I mean, look, this kind of stuff happened under Trump, but even, say, up until the 2010s, this was unthinkable. Now, there were minor cases of that, but the Iranians were not as strong. The Americans were much more willing to exercise force in the region. But it is a joke when the world superpower has not only created such a hostile situation in the region, but then is willing to even follow the logical conclusion of its own hostility when it comes to that. So these situations will continue. The Iranians will continue to harass American oil tankers, and especially as the Chinese region in the presence region grows, the American presence will be completely eclipsed. The question is, how long will the Fifth Fleet even bother staying in Bahrain in the Gulf? Will they be expelled at some point? Will there be
Yeah.
a demand from Bahrain or whoever else for the Fifth Fleet to get out of the country? I don't think that's an unreasonable prospect looking at things, all things considered, especially as Chinese presence in the region grows.
Yes. Unfortunately, I have to get going. I This is an
Well,
unexpected.
it's okay. We will put a pin in this, and we'll actually do a follow-up episode at some point in the week during this.
Yeah.
So this is our abrupt ending right here, which I think is actually a pretty decently place to abruptly end it. We weren't in the middle of anything too great, but we still have
Mhm.
a little bit of news out of Asia and a little bit of news involving Iran that we will get into next episode, and maybe touch on some issues like Sudan. So look for us later in the week, but yeah, we do unfortunately have a hard time constraint on this of like 2 hours 15 minutes, which we're reaching that mark right now. So thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report. We'll certainly be back with more sooner than later, and we'll see you guys then.
Thank you and take care.